Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diego Pina, and as always, I'm joined by Stephen Matter
Hello.
and Taylor Hirsch.
Good to be here.
Welcome to this week's episode of Arizona's Business Beacon. So, we're talking about Arizona's initiative process today, yeah?
Yes, we
Yeah.
are.
All right. Well, for those of you that don't know, Arizona was founded in 1912, and this corresponded right with the height of American progressive movement. And some of those mechanisms of direct democracy are incorporated directly into the state's constitution. And among these, as our friend Joe Pitts calls them, progressive era relics. Smiling over there. The progressive era relics is what this initiative process basically is, a relic, which, correct me if I'm wrong, was made to enable voters to enact direct change through a statute enactment or alteration, but also through a constitutional amendment, right?
Definitely. Yeah, you're exactly right. It was this was founded and created at the height of the progressive movement in the west of the United States at the time, and people felt that for Arizona and other growing state governments that the proper catalyst for this sort of direct democracy came in the form of some kind of ballot initiative process so that the people could directly enact their own legislation, because that's exactly what direct democracy means, is that they're circumventing the traditional legislative branch and the drafting process, and they're doing it themselves, or at least that was the intent. If that's what's actually going on today, that's maybe one of the questions that we're going to be asking.
Yeah, that's true. It's a good question to raise on whether or not people are actually doing it themselves or if it's corporations funding the backbone of it.
Special interests.
Yeah.
It's like the intended purpose of the initiative process was to provide regular citizens with a check against wealthy special interests.
Yeah.
And political insiders who dominate the process.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note, too, that Arizona also has a popular referendum process, which, to be modeled after something, if you look back towards the start of the initiative process, it was actually started in 1898 with the South Dakota Constitution. They were the first state to adopt it.
Going South Dakota.
Had to give my home state a little shout out.
I think it would be definitely useful to start by kind of examining like the circulatory process, because I know Diego just made reference to special interest groups, and the way that Arizona's initiative process is set up, as we all know, allows for out-of-state circulators, but also for out-of-state circulators to be paid for by out-of-state interest groups as long as they have a policy committee. I'm not sure if that's the correct term. Some sort of committee through the Secretary of State's office that's set up, and as long as they have that, that's the minimum requirement. They can pay for out-of-state circulators from an out-of-state interest group.
Yep.
What kind of political question is that?
Basically what we're seeing is a seizure, so to speak, of our initiative process carried out by these out-of-state special interests who basically are just like paratroopers parachuting into Arizona to buy their way onto the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and another thing to look at is circulators in Arizona can actually be paid per signature, so it's a very lucrative business for people to get into. I mean, you can make like $2,000 if you get 2,000 signatures.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
yeah, it's a lucrative business to be into. Yeah, you can literally, if you get paid $1 a signature and you get 2,000 signatures, you can make $2,000.
Interesting. I thought so. That's
Wow.
allowed. Pay per signature.
All right, I'm gonna cut in. It isn't allowed.
It isn't?
Oh, it is. Okay, that's what I thought.
NCSL says it
And
is.
we're welcome to talk about out-of-state circulators, but I don't think we can legally bar them anyway.
Yeah.
So I'd be more productive at I don't know.
You're right. You're right. Yeah.
And we could chop this up however we want. I don't care.
Yeah.
It's great so far. Love it.
Yeah, because
You
there was
look
a.
like you need some coffee over there.
Yeah.
I haven't drank coffee yet today, but I will soon.
'Cause I was going to mention that about how it is illegal to bar the out-of-state
Yeah.
circuit.
Yeah.
It's weird. Well, just the constitutional stuff about it too.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Okay, NCSL says it's allowed, but they must register and state it on the petition form if they're paid per signature. But then it also says cannot be paid on per signature basis.
I think as far as that goes, is they have to declare how exactly they've been hired and how exactly they are being paid, because like they're going to be paid, but it's illegal for them to be paid like on a per signature basis.
Yeah, because when we were writing the paper,
For those of you that don't know, the paper we're talking about is the white paper on Arizona's initiative process that's getting put out by Arizona Chamber Foundation's business ballot. And that should be coming out when? Soon?
Joe,
Joe?
any idea
Joe.
when we're?
Whenever it gets edited.
Cut to
Yeah.
Joe.
I don't know if the audio can hear me, so.
That's
Yeah.
true.
Well, like,
Sometime.
Sometime in the future.
Yeah.
This-
Within
soon,
the
this week.
next 2 weeks, I
This
would
next
say is a
week.
good time frame.
This-
We'll,
next week.
we'll keep you updated.
By
be sure
Wednesday,
to
it'll be out by
be sure to check out the Chamber's Twitter
Tomorrow, yeah,
if you want to find out more.
or the Business Beacon Twitter.
Yes, or the Business Beacon Twitter, and if you don't follow that already, you should.
Another weird distinction that Arizona makes is that no county recorder or justice of the peace can circulate petitions. And that's really one of the only restrictions that they had other than the pay per signature
Really?
basis. Yeah. So,
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that.
So on the also on the topic of the circulators being from out of state, there has been extensive case law regarding that, to the point where it has become illegal to bar out of state circulators from being paid for by, or at least from being out of state. It's just the issue of can they be paid for by out of state interests. That's the current political question. I don't know if changes would come to that in the form of other propositions or another Supreme Court case, but that's something to be watchful for.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this problem and just the initiative process as a whole needs to be fixed and corrected, but I just think the question is how we go about that. And I know there's some solutions out there.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about and has been kind of widely talked about looking towards other states is the fact that having a geographic distribution requirement might be helpful.
Right. There's 27 states with that, right?
I think there's a total of 27
No. Okay. My
states
bad.
that have
I'm
it.
wrong. 27 states have a voter initiative and referendum process.
Yeah.
15 of those 27 require a geographic distribution of signatures.
Yes.
My mistake.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's kind of reflective of like what the Electoral College would look like if it was kind of shrunk down into a state, meaning that for those watching, that it would require that signatures not just come from high population or high density population cities, just enough to reach the 10% threshold of the last gubernatorial election to get something on the ballot, but instead that those signatures would have to be spread evenly across the state so that it is clear that people from all parts and geographic places in the state would actually want something like that on their ballot.
Something to mention too, you just brought up the gubernatorial election percentage. So for statutory initiatives in Arizona, it's 10%. For constitutional amendments, it's 15%, which looking at the population of Arizona as a whole, it's not very big. So to qualify for an initiative in this past 2020 ballot cycle, it was 237,645 valid signatures, and then for a constitutional amendment, it was 356,476 valid signatures. So if we don't have that geographic distribution requirement, you can go sit in downtown Phoenix and probably get a good chunk of those signatures without ever visiting any of the other districts.
Yeah, and it just doesn't give those more rural districts a voice.
Yeah, and it's that's another thing. It's like until the initiative process is fixed, right? Until people start working towards that and putting down legislation to do so, whether it be another proposition or whatnot, it's important that people understand certain intricacies of the current process so that they can have that in mind when they have the ballot in front of them and they're voting. Because just like that fact in particular, if they have any idea of what the proposition is aimed at and who exactly, they're thinking of, who exactly may have got it on the ballot.
Prop 208.
Yeah.
So, for those of you that don't know, Prop 208, the Invest in Ed initiative, just passed. And for those of you who don't know, it's an education measure looking to double the state income tax on small businesses and high earners in the state. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Of their funding for this, 90% came from Stand for Children, Inc., which is a liberal education group from Portland.
Yeah, they are centered in Portland. I have that. I was just.
And that in and of itself is
Yeah.
just concerning as
Yeah,
is.
so they're a 501c organization headquartered in Oregon, and the 501c organization, that's your typical nonprofit. And so what they can do, that's your typical either political action committee or more commonly some sort of super PAC, where organizations, special interest groups funnel their money
and buy their way onto our ballot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that definitely could be said as that. Something similar, but not as cut and dry, happened with Prop 207. So Smart and Safe Arizona is the political action committee for that. Now, while they are centered here in Arizona, they did get considerable donations from business owners who have ties in California, but they also do have a large portion of their business here. However, so that's something that probably more of what we want to see, more of the money coming from Arizona, because that's the political question: is would people like the founding fathers, would people who drafted the policy in the first place, what was their intention of getting other states involved in our own initiative process? And I'd have to say, or at least I would probably predict that they would prefer that it wouldn't be involved, that other states wouldn't be involved in it.
I mean, it makes sense that they wouldn't. I mean, they're trying to protect the citizens from outside wealthy special interest groups.
I mean, one of the most important distinctions is that this is on a state level. It's for the state constitution and everything dealing with Arizona. So the fact that there's these out-of-state interest groups that are getting enticed to come and make these policy changes in Arizona for the betterment of their interests, not being from the state, is something that we definitely need to look towards reforms to change, for the simple fact that direct democracy within the state is supposed to come from the state.
Exactly. Yeah, that's from a philosophical perspective, direct democracy, the reason that there is a thing called the Electoral College is because as a whole, the United States, many people felt that having direct democracy there is not going to work because everyone doesn't know each other, right? So they say that direct democracy is supposed to work in small, tight-knit communities where, I know how people might be living in Glendale, people in Glendale know how people are probably living in Scottsdale. We have some sort of basis of our needs, whether it's geographical based or political needs or just the living situation. And so if that's going to work properly as direct democracy in a state, which, philosophy and that sort of study, political science would say that it has a better chance of working in the state, it ought to come from just in the state.
The state.
Yeah. Well, another reason why the initiative process in Arizona is so enticing to these out-of-state interests is the fact that they can sort of log roll these different needs that they have into one initiative, because we have a single subject rule for constitutional amendments, but that doesn't apply to statutory initiatives. So they can, that's what we saw with 208, was the fact that they could, log roll these different things into the bill where people don't necessarily read the small print at the end of the bill. So we saw.
They just see the flashy, fancy title that's meant to appeal to them, but they don't actually take the time to read into any of these propositions to get the gist of what they're actually going to do, the fine print,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
Devil's in the details.
Exactly.
It's like one of the main arguments against 208 from an economic perspective was that it's going to take a $2.4 billion give or take decrease in terms of output, and then while only adding anywhere from $700 to $900 million towards education, and yet we have voters who just got through the mess that happened between our school board, our school districts, and Doug Ducey, and the strike that just happened. So voters have that fresh in their mind, and they're going to the ballot, and they don't have an idea of how lucrative and how able to be taken advantage of our initiative process is, and they go to vote, and they don't understand that, hey, yes, of course we do need education reform, but it's like, okay, how about there's probably a better
Yeah.
This isn't
Yeah.
like 208. Like, no one's disagreeing that, you know, teacher schools need money, but Prop 208 was not the way to do it.
No. And looking at Prop 208, what it actually called for was if there was any decrease in the general funds, it would come from different government subsidies, such as child protective services. So what you're seeing there is that, like, Prop 208 isn't actually benefiting in all of the ways that you think it's going to, but all of these different measures are put in there, and people don't really read the fine print, and if they do,
They would understand that that's probably not a smart thing to vote for.
yeah. So,
And so it's like when we look at the ballot, when we looked at the Arizona ballot, this go around, this election, there was only 2 propositions,
Yeah,
right?
207 and
208. There was there 4 or something?
yeah, there were 4 that were proposed, but only 207 and 208 made
Yeah.
it through the entire process.
So in 2006, 19 proposed state statutes were on the ballot. So if you want to talk about voter fatigue, how are you, if that's another political question as far as how easy it is to get things on the ballot through the initiative process, whether that's as a result of a not high enough signature count or just anyone being able to include or engage in the process. How, if 2 props this go around were difficult or required a lot of thinking, or just due diligence on the voter's part in order to do the proper research to vote on those ballots. Imagine 19, right? So that could be another issue of voter fatigue that the process is definitely vulnerable to, and it has. And 2006 is a great example of that.
Yeah. I think that another thing that we see is that in other states where their initiative process is harder to get, most of the time it's constitutional initiatives. So you look to Florida where they have a 60% passage rate. You have to get 60% voter threshold of passing. They don't pass as many initiatives as Arizona does. Or you look towards Nevada where you just have to get the 50% plus 1, but you have to pass it in 2 consecutive elections. So that's giving time for the person to sit with the proposition, do due diligence.
Really, that's a thing?
I guess.
So it's 2.
Yeah.
Really?
They have to have, in Nevada, they have to have a simple majority, so the 50% plus 1, in 2 consecutive general elections. So they have so much more time to do their research on these propositions. And as in the case of 208, both of the for and against campaigns would have more time to campaign.
Wow.
But
that seems.
Yeah.
I like that. I kind of
Yeah.
like that.
yeah,
So
it's
they have to vote on it twice.
yeah, and they have to pass it
Huh.
twice. And if it doesn't pass twice, then it gets stripped. Go back to the drawing board. You can bring it up again, but
Huh.
Obviously, it adds time, but it's a lot more. What's the word I'm looking for?
Prudent.
Yeah, I guess you could say. Yeah, just
efficient.
a efficient or prudent way of
Yeah.
going about things instead of just mucking about and.
Yeah, it certainly offers a lot more time for like proper prudential deliberation.
And for people to just really get a good understanding of what they're voting on,
Yeah.
not just caught up in the
Yeah.
flash.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I mean, the way that direct democracy is run now is something that the Founding Fathers probably could have never fathomed. The people drafting the Arizona Constitution in 1912 probably never would have thought that 2020 would end up the way it is. I mean,
No one thought that.
yeah, that's true. Nobody thought 2020 was going to end up the way it did. But you look towards other states, and they have a much more intensive passage rate for constitutional amendments at the bare minimum. So looking towards, let's see, I think it's Massachusetts, yeah. So you have to get the simple majority, but you also have to have a minimum number of voters that voted on the initiative
What is
in the
voting
first
number of
place.
voters?
So in Massachusetts, it is 30%, and then Nebraska has the same thing, and I think in Nebraska it's 35%.
How do they come about those numbers?
So it's the total number of people that voted in the election, and then at least 35% of those have to have voted on the initiative. So you have to have it to where, like, if 100 people voted in the entire election, at least 30 people would have had to vote on the initiative in itself, but then you would also have to have the 50% plus one. So you'd have to have 16 votes of those 30 people that voted on the initiative.
Yeah. So just those examples right there highlight and shed light on the fact that Arizona's initiative process has a ways to go as far as
A ways,
That is
yeah.
the understatement of the century.
And I think it'd probably be fair to say that what we've talked of thus far is not even the most dangerous part, and I say like politically dangerous part of the initiative process. It's probably the VPA, the Voter Protection Act, that was
Yeah.
in 1998. And I know, Taylor, you know how that was started.
Yeah, so
Something
in
along with that.
Yeah, in 96, I believe, the voters in Arizona passed. You want to fact check me on that?
Yeah, I'm gonna fact check.
Fact
Okay,
checker.
fact check
Get
me.
her.
Part 2 for the day.
Yeah.
I'm going to wait for you before I
Oh, no, you're good.
delve
I think
into
it-
my
that is a lot.
story.
I think it was in 1996, and then 1998 was when it went down.
Yeah.
But it had to do with marijuana, right?
Yeah, so the voters in Arizona passed a measure that allowed for recreational marijuana to be used within the state. And then as soon as
Yeah.
it was passed, it was 96.
No, it was 98. Proposition 105, Arizona voter protection.
But it
But
started
it's from 96 with the medical marijuana. I'll look it up myself.
Yeah, you look this up.
But it was essentially they were worried, or they got it through, and then the state legislator or
Yeah.
the executive decided to just say no, and it was a complete, at least in the eyes of the citizens, it was a complete overarching check, too much power check on their initiative process, and it completely defeated the purpose of having the initiative process in the first place
Yeah.
if there was that much power over them.
Yeah. So in 1996, when they passed it, the legislature immediately repealed it, like you said. And then the voters kind of came up in arms, and they were upset at the fact that, they had their majority vote that they needed to pass this amendment, and it was so easy for the legislature to repeal it. Well, they passed Proposition 105 in 98, and it was a constitutional amendment, so it was relating to the initiative and referendum reform.
Yeah.
And that passed by its simple majority needed, but that made it so much harder for the legislature to amend anything. Like, they have to prove that they're furthering the intent of the bill, which has very seldomly happened in the history of Arizona politics.
And then the VPA requires that 3/4 of the state house is also needed to do so. And what that says, and this also stipulates that they can't even make corrections. The House can't even propose corrections without needing 3/4 to pass such corrections that have to do with reallocating funds if it's a certain tax. If, like, let's say in the case of 208, if they wanted to change the number, whether it was actually 78% increase on the single income over 250,000. If they wanted to do so, they couldn't without proposing another proposition. And so what that does is it makes it virtually impossible to make these changes, and it's literally easier to re-elect another candidate than it is to correct a proposition or vote or get rid of a proposition, repeal it, amend it, and that's probably a foreseen issue.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing that we're seeing with the Voter Protection Act, since in itself it was an initiative. You can't touch it.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that we'll have to pay attention to in the upcoming 2022-2024 cycles, is the fact that in and of itself, the VPA is protected.
It's definitely a lot to talk about. I mean, it's definitely a conversation that I think needs to take place and that needs to continue. And I think more Arizona voters just need to be aware of all this.
They have to. They have to be aware of it. First, so that they can change it, but also so that when they're voting now, they're not just being taken advantage of, because that's what a lot of people who have a good idea of the process on both the left and the right understand that voters can be taken advantage of through this process. There's holes in it, but I don't think that we can entirely do away with the process, and so there's a lot of work to be done.
Definitely is. I mean, it just, like I said earlier, it's just a conversation that needs to take place. But
I mean, democracy isn't perfect, and direct democracy is always going to be hard to navigate, but there's definitely ways to circumvent having all of these outside interests and Arizona voters being steered
just
one
that
way.
influence that we saw with 208. And speaking of Prop 208, be sure to join us next Friday when we talk about Prop 208's implementation and the tax outlook. Have a good afternoon, and thank you.